convocation tonight. Our fearless leader, Mary McKeever, is away tonight, so she put me in charge. Good luck with everything, right? And we are very happy to be here to welcome Ken, and I'll introduce him after a few minutes of our evening devotion, which are going to be led by Karen Alsati. Karen?
There was once a group of women studying the book of Malachi in the Old Testament. And as they were studying chapter 3, they came across verse 3, which says, "He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver." This verse puzzled the women, and they wondered what this statement meant about the character and nature of God. One of the women offered to find out about the process of refining silver and get back to the group at their next Bible study. That week, this woman called up a silversmith and made an appointment to watch him work. She didn't mention anything about the reason for her interest beyond her curiosity about the process of refining silver. As she watched the silversmith, he held a piece of silver over the fire and let it heat up. He explained that in refining silver, one needed to hold the silver in the middle of the fire where the flames were hottest, as to burn away all the impurities. The woman thought about God holding us in such a hot spot, and then she thought again about the verse that he sits as a refiner and purifier of silver. She asked the silversmith if it was true that he had to sit there in front of the fire the whole time the silver was being refined, and the man answered yes, and explained that he not only had to sit there holding the silver, but he had to keep his eyes on the silver the entire time it was in the fire. If the silver was left even a moment too long in the flames, it would be damaged. The woman was silent for a moment, and then she asked the silversmith, "How do you know when the silver is fully refined?" And he smiled at her and answered, "Oh, that's easy, when I see my image in it." If today you are feeling the heat of this world's fire, just remember that God the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, are refining you. You are predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ. And for the closing prayer, what I'm going to do is read an English translation of the Veni Sancti Spiritus, which dates back to the 12th century. And it's usually sung at Pentecost. "Come, Holy Spirit, and send forth from heaven the rays of your light. Come, lover of the poor. Come, giver of gifts. Come, light of hearts. Best comforter, sweet guest of the soul, sweet refreshment. You are our rest in labor, our coolness in the heat, our comfort in weeping. O most blessed light, fill the depths of the heart of your faithful ones. Cleanse what is soiled, water what is parched, heal what is wounded, bend what is stiff, warm what is cold, and lead home what has gone astray." Amen.
I'll take it.
Other way?
I'll just take it from you.
Oh, I turned it off.
Good. Thank you. That was beautiful, Karen. We appreciate that and the prayer as well. And welcome to those that are joining us online or who may be watching later at another time when they're able. And keep our Stephen Ministry trainees in your prayers if you would. There's 8 of them who are in the other wing of the building doing supervision training tonight. And they will be watching online later. We're grateful that you let us record this and make it available to our congregation after. There is a book table, which maybe Ken will talk about. So years ago, we got to know Mary Lynn Rush. Many of you know her. She's the founder of thedyingyear.org, and she trains people to be death doulas, to train people to walk with those who are entering into their last months and years and weeks and days, to have a partner in that process. And she also co-founded the Ann Arbor Green Burial Network with me, and she helps with home funerals and green burials. So you might have come across Mary Lynn in one or another capacity to help us as people of faith to come to the end of our earthly lives and transition to our eternal lives. And she has regular guest speakers as a part of her doula training. And so I get her newsletter and look at all the great people she brings in. And that's how I find out who we get to have, because I copy and try to get in touch with those folks, because I often don't know them until she has found them for us. And Ken Wachsberger is one of those people that came to us that way. She was having him to do a seminar for her, and it was something that I couldn't be at, and we had something at the same time as a church. So I called up Ken and asked if he would come and talk about this topic of what caught my eye when Mary Lynn presented it to her people was writing for healing. Writing is a way to heal. And as Stephen ministers, we are working with people who are seeking to be whole. And so, as a lover of words myself, I thought maybe it would be good to talk to Ken and have him educate us a bit and share some of his stories of what that means for him personally, and go even beyond that topic to what he's used this for. So I hope that you will, the book coach is his official title, but you'll get to know much more about him as he shares his story tonight. So give a warm welcome to Ken Wachsberger.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me here. Thanks to those of you who are in person for coming. Thanks to all of you online. I don't know where you are, I can't see you, but thanks for showing up. And we're talking about writing for healing and to preserve your legacy. Writing is a powerful tool. It's, I think, one of the most powerful tools for self-transformation. And, for the past 40 years, I've worked as an author, an editor, a book coach, an educator, and a speaker to help students, clients, and friends to break through the walls that have kept their important memories of the past, kept them hidden. I've helped them to change careers, to choose careers, to make major purchases. And what I want to do tonight is share a few of the stories that I've learned that have affected me so powerfully over the years. So I want to share those stories, and then I want to hear from some of you. I know you're here, you're working with your care receivers, and you're talking about writing. Writing is an amazing tool for like I said, for transformation. I want you to be able to help your care receivers to do the writing. And likewise, if you yourself have writing in you, which I'm sure a lot of you do, I want to help you with that. So I want to begin by telling a few stories that have been important to me. Then I want to allow you to take over for a while. I want to answer your questions, see what you've got going on. And then before we end, I want to share some the secret to writing more, better with today's technology. Okay, and the technology that I'm talking about is really simple technology. You probably already use it and just don't realize how powerful it is. So I'll be talking about how to use it. Sound like a game plan? Okay, let's get going. The first story I want to share begins in 1987. That's when I began teaching freshman composition at Eastern Michigan University. Freshman comp, as we called it affectionately, that was the class that every student hated and every major required. Nobody wanted to take it, everybody had to take it. And I was there on the crossroads. I was teaching 4 classes a semester, 25 students a class, 100 students every semester who did not want to be there. The mandate for the class was the 20-page research paper on a current event topic of little or no interest to anybody. By the end of the semester, my students hated writing, I hated teaching writing, and then the next semester began. We started all over again. So this went on for a while. Finally, one night, I had a dream. And in that dream, a voice came to me out of the darkness of the night. And it said, in a voice way lower than I can reach, "Ken, are you nuts?" And that was it. Then it went silent on me. But I woke up the next morning shaken. That day in school, it was day 1 of the new semester. I passed out my syllabus, 100 copies of the syllabus that I had just spent 2 weeks writing. I said, here's your syllabus. We're not going to be using it. And I began to share my new vision. And the first thing I said to them was, you know that 20-page paper? I said, forget it. I said, you can write as much as you want. Okay, that threw them off. They were thinking I was going to forget everything. But it's a writing class. Of course you're going to write. But I said, you can write whatever you want. There was a theory behind that. And I really wasn't quite as in touch with it as I am now. It was just kind of gut level then. But what I knew was that when you give someone a 20-page paper, they write 20 pages and then they're done. And to them, it's enough because teachers said 20 pages and they've got 20 pages. In my estimation, that wasn't done. If you're done, if you reach the point, if you say everything you need, you're done. But 20 pages doesn't equal done. So I didn't want them to think that way. So I said, forget it. No page count. You can write whatever you want. And they were very uncomfortable by that, but they grew into it eventually. But the other thing I said about that current event topic, I said, forget it. I said, you can write anything you want, any topic you want, any topic in the world. One criterion, of course, as long as you care about it, as long as it matters to you, as long as there's an I factor, the I, the pronoun, okay? As long as it matters to you, there's some personal reason for it, yeah, it's a good topic. Okay, and I met with every student one-on-one to help them fine-tune the topic, to help them find resources. But the bottom line was you can do anything you want as long as there's an I factor. Now, a number of the students resisted. They didn't get it. They didn't want to be in there in the first place. The idea of saying you can write anything you want, well, they didn't want to write anything. So that didn't kind of really come together for them right away. Other students, though, they embraced it. They ran with this. And by the end of the semester, for the first time ever, I had students going, my God, Ken, this class changed my life. Wow, that was pretty heavy. From a class they didn't want to take, changed their life. And there's so many stories that I could tell you to illustrate what I mean. So many stories. I'm going to pick just one of them. One story that I like. I had a student who did a paper on alcoholism. Okay, now that's a pretty academic sounding topic. What was the I factor? Well, the I factor was her dad was an alcoholic, and it led to the breakup of the family. So what she wanted to do was learn about alcoholism and then help her father, which meant get him to not be an alcoholic, and then bring the family together again. That's all. 15 weeks. That's what she wanted to do. Okay, well, she was motivated. She was really motivated. She read books. She read articles. She interviewed the most important people on the topic. Who do you think the most important people were? Was it? Well, yeah. Actually, her sister, her brother, her mother, and ultimately, her father. Wow. What do you think happened? What do you think the result of that trip was?
Must be good or you wouldn't be telling us.
Okay. Well, let's put it this way. It must be good, she said. Did she bring the family back together?
Did she?
I'm asking you.
Yes.
No.
Well, okay, the answer is, don't struggle with this one. The answer is, it was a total bust. It was a total bust. Her dad came into it an alcoholic. He left an alcoholic. He was going to stay an alcoholic. The family wasn't coming together. It was a total bust. But she had a realization. She didn't know it was a realization to have. She had this realization. What she realized was, if her dad didn't want to get better, there was nothing she could do. Nothing she could do. And a weight was lifted. This was a weight she didn't even know she was carrying. All of a sudden, it was lifted. Here was this 6-year-old girl whose parents were going through a divorce. And what happens to 6-year-old kids when their parents go through divorces? They blame themselves. She blamed herself. And of course, nobody had the foresight to say, oh, by the way, your parents are getting divorced, but it's not your fault. Don't worry about it. Nobody thought to say that. And so she internalized it. She believed it was her fault. And she grew up believing that this whole tragedy in her family was her fault. And now, 2/3 of her life later, she's 18 now, she was 6 then, 2/3 of her life later, all of a sudden it hits her, it was all a lie. It was not her fault. And she was free. There was this incredible freedom, and she was still sad. Why was she still sad?
Her family was still apart.
Yeah, very good. Her family was still apart. Her dad was still an alcoholic. Yeah, she felt bad about that, a lot of sadness. But she no longer carried the blame. She was free. It was huge. She was so excited when she came in to tell me that this realization she had. And naturally, I cried. I'm a Wachsberger. We cry all the time. But it was amazing. It was amazing. And this was just one of so many stories that I experienced. The paper that I was teaching them, it was called an iSearch paper. I-search. And I didn't make up the idea. Another Ken did, in fact, a professor named Ken McCrory. He taught at, I forget either Central or Western, one of those two, another one of the geographical places. But he came up with this idea, and he gave a few assignments to his students. He was happy with it, and he wrote a whole book about this, what he called an iSearch paper. And but he never really developed it as far as I could see. I read the book, and I read the book the weekend before that class. That's when I had the dream. After I read the book, I said, I can't do this anymore. I can't anymore teach the traditional paper. I can't teach them to write what they hate writing. It's not going to work. And I changed it. So he wrote a book that went out to other teachers, just to share his findings, what he had learned. I read that, and I said, I got to do it myself. And I ended up turning it into a textbook. And that's the textbook. Transforming Lives, a socially responsible guide to the magic of writing and researching. I use that, and I used it for many years. A lot of other professors used it too. I was really happy with how that turned out. It was called, one English teacher from Detroit, high school, her daughter was one of my students. She called it an anti-textbook. So I thought that was kind of, because it's a textbook, but it doesn't have the feel of it. But, so that's the story. Are there any questions on that? Any questions? Pretty exciting experience there. The next story I want to tell, this is actually a blend of writing for healing and writing to preserve your legacy. This is both at once. I've never had a better example of both of them together. Bernard Mednicki was a Belgian Jew who fled Belgium in 1940 when the Nazis invaded, took his family to southern France, posed as a Christian, and through a series of incidents found his way into the Maquis, the French resistance. While he was there, while he was in the Maquis, he committed an atrocity so horrendous that he was forced to squelch it. He couldn't even deal with it. He never spoke about it. He blocked it. You know, the war ended. He went back home to his wife and kids. He never told his wife about it. They later moved to America. They settled in Philadelphia. She died. He remarried. Never told his second wife. Somewhere along the way, he actually forgot it. I mean, it just disappeared altogether. He wasn't holding it anymore. He just forgot it. It wasn't there. But over the years, bits and pieces of the memory began to squeeze through the walls. You know, the cracks in the wall began to squeeze through, and he became disturbed by it. And he started having nightmares. But in his nightmares, he spoke in French, and his second wife didn't understand French. In the mornings would come, she'd say, Bernard, you had a nightmare last night, but I don't know what you said. You spoke in French. So he began speaking publicly. He spoke everywhere. He spoke to elementary school kids, to high schoolers, to college students, to senior citizens. He spoke every chance he could get. But the format was always the same. About 40 minutes of stories, 20 minutes of QA. So he never was able to go deep. So I met him at a Holocaust conference in Millersville, Pennsylvania, Millersville University. Now I was there because I was born in 1949, so I'm part of the first generation after the war. Now during those years, growing up in the 50s, during those years, anybody who had survived the Holocaust wasn't talking about it. I mean, it was so traumatic. How can you put it into words? Nothing like this had ever happened. It was just hard to talk about it, so nobody talked about it. And this included not just the people who had survived the camps, but people who had been in the resistance also. They were traumatized also. And so they never spoke about it. And so this mythology arose during the 50s that there had been no resistance. And that, in fact, the Jews had gone, I'm sure you've heard the expression, like lambs to the slaughter. Well, as a young Jew growing up, I was embarrassed by that. I was embarrassed. I mean, on one hand, this atrocity, you knew that even if they had resisted, they probably would have died. You knew that. But I wanted to believe at least they had gone with their fists up. Maybe take out a few Nazis before you go. I mean, do something. But I wanted to believe they had fought back. But no, it was a fact that they had gone like lambs to the slaughter. This is how I lived it. So I grew up, on one hand, believing it. On the other hand, there's that part of me that's a cynic, that doesn't believe everything. I had that little bit of doubt. No, it could not have been. There's no way it could have been. So years later, when I was going through my master's program at Michigan State University, it was master's in creative writing. I took a class on literature of the Holocaust. And as my research paper, I asked the question, was there a resistance? I just wanted to know if there was a resistance. Well, what I found out, fortunately, was there was a huge resistance. As I anticipated, the Jews got slaughtered anyway. So I'm doing research to find out if there had been a resistance. Okay, and what I discovered was there was a huge resistance. It's a huge, in every camp, there was resistance. In every one of the shtetls, that's the East European Jewish ghettos were known as shtetls. But in every one of them, there was resistance. Again, the Jews got slaughtered anyhow. The odds were against them. And that's the story for a different time. But bottom line was, they got slaughtered, but they fought back on the way down. And in fact, now there was a growing body of literature about the resistance. There was so much that the literature now was growing. So much so that there was now this conference devoted not just to the Holocaust, but to the resistance within the Holocaust. Very exciting. So I submitted my paper, and it's a great academic. It got accepted, and I went to Millersville to present it. The night before the conference, the local Hillel, which is the Jewish organization on campus, the local Hillel hosted a reception for all the out-of-town guests, the speakers. So they hosted a reception. So I was there, and I'm walking along. I've got my wine glass in one hand, my 6-inch hors d'oeuvre plate in the other hand, looking for a place to sit, a place to be comfortable. And I see this old guy sitting all by himself against the wall. And he's just sitting there. His legs are slightly spread. He's got the cane between his legs, his hands cupped over his cane, and he's just sitting there observing the scene. He was a rotund guy, really, really rotund, and he had a huge bushy beard. If he'd been anywhere else but a Hillel, you would have sworn he was Santa Claus. And so he sat there, and he looked comfortable to me, and so I approached him. I said, hello. Well, he starts talking, and he has a thick European accent. So at first, I couldn't understand him. I wasn't ready for it. Now I had to zero in on European accent. So it took me a little bit, but I began to pick up a word here, a phrase there, a sentence now, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it hit me. This guy was in the resistance. He was the guy I'd been looking for all my life. I mean, I grew up wanting to know, was there a resistance? Here's a guy who was in it. And he wasn't the father of one of the speakers like I thought at first. He was one of the speakers. And I was so excited to meet him that I just followed him around all night. And I listened to his stories, and I tried to remember as much as I could. I knew there was no way I could remember them all. Every now and then I'd sneak away and go to the bathroom and pull out my notebook, the notebook that I always had in my back pocket, this one. And I'd write down notes, then I'd go back to him. He's still sitting by himself, so we'd start talking again, and I'd listen, and my mind would overflow, and I'd sneak away to the bathroom again. By the third time I had to sneak away to the bathroom, I finally admitted I was embarrassed, spoke so many times. I told him that I was just fascinated by him. And he said, anytime you want to visit me in Philadelphia, I'll tell you all the stories you want to hear. Well, wow, that was a thrill. Well, as it turned out, that summer, Emily and I and our son, David, were driving to New York. Emily's from New York, so we're going to visit her family. On the way there, we stopped in Philadelphia. We spent the night, and the next morning he asked me to write his story. So it's a huge thrill for me. Logistically, it took us a while to bring it all together. We were still living in Lansing, but we were on the way, getting ready to move to Ann Arbor. Then we did move to Ann Arbor, but we had to get settled. Then we finally got settled. So it just took a while to get all this together. But finally we were settled. We brought Bernard and his second wife, Minnie. They came to Ann Arbor, and they stayed with us for 2 weeks. During that time, I conducted a series of extensive interviews. It turned out 18 hours worth. If you remember the old 90-minute cassette tapes, with 45 minutes on each side, when they get to the end of the first side, there's that irritating click, which tells you it's time to flip the tape over. I used that, and I bought a carton of them. They came in a carton of 12, and that was good because I used all 12 of them. But we sat down for the first day, and I said to him, we're just sitting over the kitchen table. I said to him, Bernard, where does your story begin? That was my first question. Where does your story begin? And he started talking, and talking, and talking, and talking. Bernard was a natural storyteller, and he had this amazing story to tell, and he was compelled now to tell it. So he just kept talking and talking, and I realized real early on that I didn't want to be interrupting him. I mean, there were so many questions. What do you mean by this? Who's that? When did this happen? Can you clarify this? I mean, so many questions were coming up, but I didn't want to interrupt him every time a question came up. I wanted him to get the flow, to get the overview. And so I just waited. I took a lot of notes, and he talked and talked. And after 6 tapes, 9 hours, he said, and that's my story. And that's when a click. I think it was that close, and right to the end of the last tape, he spoke. So we took a day off to give him a break and to help me to organize my notes, go over the questions, expand them, tighten them up, put them in the right order, whatever I needed to do to get ready. And then we resumed again the next day. So tape 7 began actually on the 8th day that he was there. And this time through now, it was all QA. Okay, the first time it was just him talking. Now it was QA. I'd ask a question, he'd answer it and stop. I'd ask another question, he'd answer it and stop. And this went on, turned out for another 6 tapes. I don't know the karma of how that'll happen, but it was 6 more tapes. But I had no idea, to me as the young interviewer, I was so focused on I want to get this right, that I was not at all in touch with what Bernard was going through. Well, Bernard was going through some incredibly stressful times during this interview. He was taking, every night before he went to bed, he would take 2 sleeping pills. The next morning, he was always the first one up. 2 sleeping pills to get to sleep, first one up the next morning, every time. Okay, so we're now on the QA portion here, or the second part of the interview. We get to tape 11. Okay, now in tape 11, we happen to be back in the Maquis. Okay, back in the Maquis, and he's telling me about the 2 times when he killed somebody one-on-one. He always said he preferred the hand grenade to the gun or the knife. The hand grenade, you toss it, you turn around, you close your eyes, you cover your ears, the explosion goes off, maybe somebody dies, maybe somebody doesn't die, you don't know. But with a gun or a knife, you know. So he preferred the hand grenade. And ironically, the first time he killed somebody one-on-one, it was with a hand grenade. It beat him over the head, okay? But at this moment, we were talking about the second time, when he slit a guy's throat. And I had my whole list of questions ready to go. And I looked at the question, but before I could ask it, another question popped into my head. And it turns out it was the best question I'd ever asked, anywhere, at least in the professional world. And I asked him that question instead, and he responded immediately. And he said, I don't remember. And he was harsh, he kind of pushed me back. I couldn't tell if he was angry or if he really didn't remember. I didn't know. What I knew was that before we had begun the interviews, we had had an agreement. Any question I asked, he was going to answer fully. That was the deal. So he might have been angry, but he owed me an answer. And I wanted the answer. On the other hand, if he was so angry, he might blow off the whole interview. Forget it, I'm out of here. I didn't want that to happen. So I was tempted to ask another question to salvage it. On the other hand, in the world of journalism, there's a cardinal rule. Don't step on the silence. What that means, if you ask a good question, they may not have an immediate answer because they want their answer to rise to the level of the question. So maybe he was in that silence. Maybe that's what was going on. On the other hand, maybe he was really angry and I was about to lose him. So I was going back and forth. Should I ask another question? Should I honor the silence, ask another question? I didn't know, and I'm worried. I'm really worried because of this awful silence that's going on. And for what it's worth, when I listened to the tape later on, I think it was 7 seconds. Okay, it was not long, but as it was happening, it seemed like forever. And I was afraid of losing him. And so I was just about, I looked at my question, I was just about to ask another question. Just about to ask another question, to salvage it. When all of a sudden he said, yes, I remember. Which meant, of course, he really did forget. He really had forgotten, and he just now remembered something for the first time in over 40 years. And he burst out crying. We're sitting at the kitchen table, his elbows are on the table, he buries his eyes in his hands, and he starts crying, he's sobbing, and memories begin to come out. And they're so painful that he comes out with a little memory, he just pulls back, changes the subject, talks about something else, but he's drawn back into it, and he reveals a little bit more of the memory. But he pulls away again, but not quite as far this time. And then he's pulled back in with another memory, but deeper into it. He pulls away, not as far anymore. And eventually, he's so far into it, he can't pull out anymore. And he just sobs and sobs, and as he's sobbing, the story comes out. It just comes out, and he cries and cries, and all of a sudden he stops. And he says, I'm done. He said, I've now said everything. I've turned my mind inside out, upside down. There's nothing left to say. And then he said, I'm now ready to see my ancestors. Wow, this happened right over the kitchen table. I couldn't believe this was going on. We ended that session early. That was the only session of the 12 that didn't go the full 90 minutes, the full hour and a half. We stopped a little, well, it was over an hour, I'm pretty sure, but it was a little short of an hour and a half. That night, for the first time, what do you think?
No sleeping pills.
No sleeping pills. First time. No, the next morning,
That's the first one.
he was still sleeping when I got up. Yeah. No sleeping pills, still sleeping. First time. You knew something had happened there. It was pretty obvious. So we had one more session after that, just to wrap things up. And then after that, he went home, and Minnie went home. Okay, I was going to get to that, but go ahead. They went home. I finished the book, and I sent him the manuscript. I sent him the complete manuscript. He read the whole thing. He loved the book. He photocopied it 12 times. He passed it out to family members, and he was done. As far as he was concerned, he was done. He preserved the legacy of Jews as fighters, not as lambs. That was what he wanted to do, and now he was done. Not long after that, his family moved him into a rest home, assisted living, and shortly after that, he died. He never saw the finished book. He never saw it, but he didn't care about that. He had preserved the legacy, and also he was ready to see his ancestors. I mean, he had done both, in other words. He had the legacy, but also the healing. He had found all this healing through the interview process. It was just amazing. So this is the book. This is the book he wrote. It's called, I wrote with him, it's called Never Be Afraid, A Belgian Jew in the French Resistance. Never be afraid is what he said when he was telling me the story. He brought his family to Ellis Island, and now on Ellis Island he's looking back, and he says to me, never be afraid. And as soon as he said that, I went, that's the title of the book. As soon as he said it, I was going with the working title of a Jew in the Maquis. To me, that was the high point. That this was a guy who was in the resistance, the Maquis. So my working title all the way through was a Jew in the Maquis. But as soon as he said that, I went, that's the title. So it became the first edition of the book said, Never Be Afraid, a Jew in the Maquis. What I discovered after the book came out, lo and behold, nobody knew what the Maquis was. So when I went for a second edition, I changed it to Never Be Afraid, a Belgian Jew in the French Resistance. But it's an amazing story. Bernard was a natural storyteller. There's a tradition in Jewish literature that the Yiddish writers, the ones who write about the shtetls, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Bernard Malamud, Chaim Potok, I don't know if that means anything to you, but he was of that tradition. He was one of them, but they were writers. He wasn't a writer, but he was a storyteller. So I was one who got his story. So that's an amazing story. The chapter where he has this major revelation, it's chapter 19. It's called Like Blood Out of the Aorta of a Pig. It's tough to say that fast, but it's like blood out of the aorta of a pig. So it's one of the best chapters I ever wrote, if I do say. And but don't skip to that one. If you're going to get the book, read the whole thing. It's really a good book. But so that was that. Are there any questions about Bernard's story, about that whole process? This is there's some lessons you can learn in how to interview through this. I mean, this was really a major job of interviewing that pulled this off. So that's that one. Now there's one other story. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this one, but it's in the back. I wrote during the anti-war period, during the Vietnam War. I was part of the anti-war movement, and I wrote on what was called the underground press. That was the dissident press, the anti-war press. And years later, I wrote a history of the East Lansing underground press. That was kind of my stomping grounds during the war. So I wrote a history of the East Lansing underground press. And then I shared it with veterans of other underground papers from all over the country. And I got such a response, and I said, can you give me a similar history of your paper? And I got this amazing response from people. And as a result, I was able to put together a book that was 600 plus pages in an 8.5 by 11 2-column format. If you visualize that, it's a thick book, a lot of words. And Micah's was one of the stories. Michael Kinman, he was one of the legends of the underground press, one of the early founders. By the time I tracked him down, he was living in San Francisco and he was dying of AIDS. So he worked with me for 2 years on his book. And again, legacy. He was so focused on wanting to write the book that he worked on it for 2 years. About 2 or 3 months after he finished his manuscript. We hadn't published the whole series yet. I got a call from his partner who told me that Mike had died. So when we published the book ourselves, we didn't find a traditional press. We did our own. We created our own press. We named it Micah Press after him. Years later, Michigan State University Press picked up the whole series and broke it up into 4 books, which is really what it should have been in the first place. It was so thick. Micah's was the longest piece in the whole book, and so it really became its own volume. Okay, there are 2 volumes that are collections of pieces. There are 2 volumes that are actually monographs because the pieces were so long. So that's his piece. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about the series right now, although it's a fascinating series. But that's that one. Any questions? One more I want to tell you about here. This is personal. In May of 2000, we learned that Emily had breast cancer. It was the Friday before Mother's Day. In fact, it was May 9th. Okay, tomorrow was May 9th. So 23 years ago tomorrow, we discovered that she had breast cancer. We spent all of Mother's Day weekend thinking about death. And then that Monday, the day after Mother's Day, we spent the whole day in the hospital finding out the extent of the cancer and what the hospital was going to do and what the treatment was going to be and what the recovery was going to include. And we met the staff and we learned all the resources that University of Michigan Hospital has. If you're going to get cancer, that's a great place to have it. And then the recovery began, But then she came home, and that Friday, which was a week after we learned about it, she had the operation. It was a full double mastectomy and reconstruction all in one day. So all of this was a week, from learning about it to having the whole operation. And then the recovery began. Now, for me, I had begun keeping a journal when I was in college. All through college, I kept a journal. I dropped out of school, became part of the anti-war movement. I continued keeping the journal. So most of the way through the 70s, somewhere along the way, I stopped doing it every day. But for a good way through the 70s, I was keeping a journal every single day. So at some point I stopped, but the journal was always there when I needed it. When this was all happening, I needed the journal. I returned to it. So I started keeping it. As it turned out, my family, my extended family, had a listserv, and it was mostly for good news. The weddings, the bar mitzvahs, the bat mitzvahs, the births, the graduations, all the good news we shared on the listserv. Well, the Monday after the operation, I wrote on the listserv, and I said, I've got bad news. Emily's got breast cancer. And then I simply reproduced everything that I had written in the journal. So they had a complete update on what was going on. And the reason I did this, I don't have a problem talking about these things. What I didn't want to do was have to go over the same information over and over and over and over. And the questions you're going to ask naturally are going to be pretty much the same. What happened? Da-da-da-da. I didn't want to have to do that. So I figured if I shared the A-level questions, then when they came back with questions, they could be more B-level, C-level, different people could ask different questions, but they'd all have the basic information there. So that was really the strategy behind why I did that. What I got, though, totally unexpected, not asked for, but certainly welcomed, was an influx, a flow, a barrage of love in the form of letters and cards and emails and phone calls and visits and food and just so many expressions of love, and it felt so good. It felt so good, and it was unexpected. Emily, meanwhile, the mantra at U of M Hospital is no pain. Okay, what that means is that she was totally drugged up. Okay, she wasn't in nearly the pain she could have been otherwise, so that was good. but she was totally drugged up. So, my office in those days was in the basement. I would get news. I'd go upstairs to the family room, which was the next door, level up, and Emily was sitting, she had her spot on the reclining chair in front of the TV. And she just sat there all day long, just sitting. She didn't have a lot of energy to do much else. But when I would come up, every time I heard news from somebody, I would share it with Emily, and it always made her feel better. Oh, no matter what it was, no matter what the gift was, no matter what the show of expression was, they all made her feel better, and they made me feel better. And so I continued doing this. I continued keeping the journal. Every few days I would share an update with everybody. And I did it all the way through the breast cancer. And it was good. It really helped a lot. And something else happened, though. What I realized was, now Emily obviously was the main victim. She was what I call the perceived victim. You think of breast cancer, who's the victim? The one with the breast cancer. Okay? That makes sense. I was the support person. I was the primary caregiver there. And what I discovered, there was a lot of information out there about how I could help her. But there was nothing, and I looked real hard, there was nothing, no literature at all, about how I could keep sane while I was helping her. And I had to keep sane because I had to take care of her. And if I start to lose it, I'm not there for her. So I had to keep it together. And there was really nothing that I could see that could help me. And I realized that I was, she's the perceived victim. I was what I call the silent victim. And so I started thinking, well, what did I do? What did I do that helped? What did I not do that I should have done that would have helped? I started keeping track of all the different ways that I could keep sane. And I came up with a list of 21 ways to keep sane. Number 1, by the way, is keeping a journal, and number 2 is sharing the journal, okay, which I had already done. But I came up with 21 ways. And so when we were done with the breast cancer, I wanted to publish it. And Emily was fine with the 21 ways. She was a little sensitive, a little raw about the story. When I said the journal, I thought the journal was good writing. It was informative, and it could really help a lot of people. But it was Emily's story. It was my writing, but it was her story. And she was a little bit raw on it, and she requested that I not publish the journal. I respected that. So what I did was, the first time through, I published just the 21 ways. I don't have this on the PowerPoint, but this is what I did. It's called Your Partner Has Breast Cancer, 21 Ways to Keep Sane as a Support Person. Years later, technology was improving. Emily was more distant from the event itself. She wasn't as raw. I asked again, do you mind if I publish it? She said, go ahead. And this is what we came up with. Your Partner Has Breast Cancer, 21 Ways to Keep Sane as a Support Person. On your journey, I expanded the subtitle, On Your Journey from Victim to Survivor. And I'm delighted I did that. It's been very helpful to a lot of people, especially support people, caregivers. So, what was my I factor? When I wrote the book, I talked about the I factor. When I did all this, what was my I factor?
It's your wife.
What's that?
It's your wife.
Yeah, it's my wife. And I needed to keep sane throughout the whole process. I was real motivated. This was not an academic exercise for me. I wasn't interested in what percentage of women get breast cancer. It just didn't matter. What mattered was my wife had breast cancer, and I had to keep it together to help her. So it was that was my I factor. Okay, and that's what came out of it. So what I'm asking now is, what's your I factor? And I'm talking now to you, but also to anybody who's on online watching us. What questions do you have? Are you doing any writing yourself that you need help with, or are you interested in writing for your, helping your care receivers write? Okay.
Yeah, I am.
Tell me about it.
I feel that I am lagging behind in staying up to date on life changes that me and my wife are going through just in natural aging. No incipient, no tragedies. Thank you very much. Yes. Oh, here we go. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Ken. I think that my eye interest is in recentering myself and realizing where my wife and I are in our maturing, in our aging, and that it's not always jumping ballast out of the balloon so you don't bump into the mountain. There are some pluses that come. And that's what my father said when he was quite ill, nearly his last illness. He said, there's some compensations.
Compensations?
There are some compensations. There are some rewards that can only come at this time of life.
Oh, good, okay. How do you feel about that?
I need to find them.
Okay.
Or I have some idea, but I want to have a sharper focus that'll guide me with allocation of my time, resources, my wife's time, resources.
Now, have you started writing about any of this?
No, but I think I'm going to.
Good. Oh,
I
good.
will.
Okay.
I will.
Good. Okay. Okay. We're going to talk in a little bit about how to get going with that.
Outstanding.
Okay. Anybody
Let's go.
else? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think when you were talking about the books that you wrote about the gentleman active in the marquee, you said you asked him a question to begin the series of interviews.
Uh-huh.
And repeat that question.
I said, where does your story begin?
Where did you start?
Yeah.
So I'm remembering that as
Uh-huh.
talking, and I wonder, as you wrote this and other pieces, are there questions that you ask yourself? Is there a structure that you have or could recommend to, like for Bill or any of us, to stimulate how we start a story? Or some
Okay,
questions
well-
you ask yourself.
Well, I'll be talking in a little bit about free writing. If anyone has done free writing before, I'm going to help you elevate that to a higher level. And that's going to be part of the answer there.
Okay.
But the other thing is, if you're keeping a journal is pretty linear. Today I did this. It starts here, and that's how I wrote the journal there. It was nothing real. I didn't think it was that creative. It was just straightforward. But there was a fascinating story to be told, and I simply told it. And that's what your journal is. So a journal is a good place to start. When I went away to college, my dad gave me one of these appointment books that he used to own a clothing store, and one of the suit companies used to give him every year. So he gave it to me, an appointment book when I went off to college, and he said encouraged me to keep a journal. He said college is going to be the most exciting time of your life. Keep a journal. Well, of course, what I interpreted that to mean is that after college it's all downhill, and I didn't feel good about that. But I did begin keeping a journal, and it was very much today I did this. In fact, all through college I can tell you to the 5 minutes what time I went to bed. It's just one of those things. But yeah, journal is just very straightforward. Now, as I continued to keep that journal, I began to kind of outgrow the truth. Okay? In other words, if something happened that was almost a great story, I would write it as the great story, not as how it actually happened. Fictionalized a little bit, in other words. In fact, my first book, it's called Beer Cans on the Side of the Road, the story of Henry the Hitchhiker. I was a hitchhiker throughout the 70s, and a lot of that's taken right out of my journal. So it's, that's what you can do, though. Take the journal, and then you just run with the fiction, and it becomes more than just the journal. Yes.
This is kind of an off question, but do you do all of your own self-publishing, or do you have to work with a publisher?
Good question. I've gone both ways. A number of my books I've published through other companies. Nowadays, I'm leaning more and more towards independent publishing. The 4-volume set that I told you about, the one that Mike Kinman was part of, that Michigan State University Press published that one. But that was the second edition. The first time it came out, we published it ourselves. So you can go from one to the next. But yeah, most of the books that I've shown here, I published independently. I'm leaning in that direction. I like it for a number of reasons. In my another book, which I haven't talked about yet, but it's a book that I wrote about how to write a book. It's called You've Got the Time. The subtitle is How to Write and Publish That Book in You. And there's a major part that compares traditional publishing to independent publishing. There's another part that talks about book contracts. I've been a book contract advisor with the National Writers Union for over 30 years. And so I've reviewed over and over so many contracts, and I know that all of them are horrible. Mm-hmm. They're just all horrible. You can negotiate and make them better, but chances are you're not going to make it good, unless you're really a superstar. Mm-hmm. But for most of us, we're going to end up with a bad. You just kind of have to grit your teeth and think, well, it's better than nothing. But, I show you how to at least make it better. But it's my resentment, frankly, against those horrible contracts that is just, and the new technology. The technology is so good nowadays. It's so good that you can do your own book. You don't look at a book and go, well, that was self-published. You can look at a book and it looks like any other book. So I've gone both ways. I'm leaning more towards independent nowadays.
I just want to say, Ken, that I think for our student ministers, one of the things that they can do as they're hearing this presentation, especially thinking about what the journey that you've had with your partner, is to help their care receivers to begin to write some things down. One of the things we do in our grief support group is that we often have people write a letter to the person they've lost, that they're grieving. And they may or may not share that with the group. They may or may not throw it away after they do it, but it's that process of thinking through those emotions and what they want to share, and then in some ways being able to talk about the experience of that with the other mourners in the room, those that are all suffering. And that we often find that has a healing element, like any support group, but when you add the written element to it, I think it does help. I was at a writers' conference in September in Alaska with a woman named Leslie Leyland Fields, and her book is called Your Story Matters, and she encourages people to write their own stories as well. But she had us all write a story of our life that we felt like needed to be told, but we didn't really know where we would tell it except within this group, and we had to write it down and get it to 5 minutes and try to make it into something where we could, it would be redemptive. We could find a redemptive element to it as we're writing it. And so I had this experience with my father that was very, very troubling and trying, that years and years, nobody had really heard that story, and I was managed to write it down into a 5-minute piece with a spiritual, bent at the end that I could share with a group of other spiritual people. And that was a huge part of my own healing journey with what happened with my father, because he's deceased now.
Yeah.
I had that story, and I may be able to share it as a part of a collection. It's not something I can tell from the pulpit. I'm a preacher, so I write for the ear, but I do think there's something very, there can be something very cathartic and helpful about this, what you're talking about. So thank you for helping them think about how to use this with the people that they're walking with who are suffering.
No, absolutely. When both of my parents died, I wrote a blog for each one of them after they died, and yeah, it was helpful to me. I mean, it shared my parents with everybody else. They were pretty remarkable people, so I'm really thrilled, to be able to share them. But it would help me too, which is good to be able to put it all there and everything I wanted to say. Any other questions? What I want to do before I lose all of you is I want to share the secret to writing more, better, with today's technology. Okay, and the technology is it's so simple. You've all heard of it, but it all begins by this. If you're writing a book, right now you've already begun. You have already begun it. Okay, now if the thoughts are all in your head, they're not on paper, they're not on the laptop, but they're there. You've got the thoughts already. And they're swirling all over the place. You got a ton of thoughts. You know, people who you want to be part of the story, incidents that you can't remember when they all happened, but you know they got to go somewhere in the story. Favorite quotes of your own, you know, words of wisdom that you want to pass on to the next generation. I mean, you've got all these ideas and thoughts going on already in your head, but you're sitting here going, okay, I'm stuck. What do I do first? And that's where we run into trouble. What do we do first? What I'm here to tell you is it doesn't matter what you do first. Just spit it out. At first, when you're starting out, just spit it out. Now, this is the epitome of what free writing is. Free writing is writing with no worrying about order or anything. You just spit the thoughts out. But they've got to get out. You can't write a book in your head. We're writers, not rememberers. Remember that. We're writers, not rememberers. So you've got to get the thoughts out. So just spit them out. You know, mechanics, grammar, and spelling, don't worry about that. You'll get to that later. All those crazy thoughts, I'm no good, I'm not smart, I'm not a good writer, I'll never get it published anyhow, nobody's going to buy the book. All those crazy thoughts, if you have them swirling around in your mind, they're taking up valuable real estate that your good ideas need to grow. So spit them out and then throw them out. You know, either delete them or just move them into another file, but get them out of your mind and keep on free writing. And what's going to happen is that before long, the crazy ideas will dissipate and the good ideas will predominate. And just keep on free writing until you run out. You know, at some point, your mind is going to burn out. You're going to need to replenish your creative side, rejuvenate. So you got to stop. But go at least until you get to that point, okay? Then when you pull back to let yourself rejuvenate, look at what you've got. Now you could, you know, some people start writing on paper, some do it right in the computer. I encourage you to do it in the computer. But if you do it on paper, as soon as you get done with the free write, type it up. Because you're not going to write a book on paper. It's got to get on the computer at some point. So once you type it up, once it's on the computer, look at it. What you're going to find is it's going to be a mess. You're going to have ideas going all over the place. You know, you'll have the lists, you'll have the stories, you'll get inspired and begin a story. But then you'll as you're writing another story will come up and you'll start writing about that and leave this one behind incomplete. You'll keep going, and this is just natural. This is what your mind is doing anyhow. Your mind is already going from idea to idea. Okay? So all you're doing is doing what, you know, going with your mind. Okay? So when you get it down there. Now you look at this mess. Now you need to start putting it in order. Okay? So here's where you use the miracle of modern technology. How many of you are familiar with cut and paste? Anybody? Okay, it's there, it's been around. To me, it's new if it's here since the 70s. Okay, that's when I started publishing. So, but that's all it is, cut and paste. You look at your keyboard, you hit cut and Control X, and then you cut it, you copy and paste. Control X. What you do is when you take the cursor and you put it over the content that you want to get rid of, that you want to move somewhere else, and you hit Control X. Control is at the bottom left of the keyboard. Control X, it disappears. Then you move the cursor to where you want the material to reappear, and you hit Control V. And poof, there it is. Okay, so it's no longer where it was, now it's here where you want it to be. Now sometimes you want to move it, but you also want to keep it where it was. In other words, you want it to be there twice. Okay, in that case you do Control C, which copies it, and then you do Control V, and that pastes it down. Okay, now for the purposes of this exercise though, we're Control X, because we're moving stuff, we're not duplicating it. So what you do is You want to group your ideas, okay? Whatever you wrote first, consider that group one. Whatever it was, doesn't matter, okay? Look through the whole free write and find any other ideas that are on the same basic topic. Control X, highlight it, Control X, move the cursor to the end of that first thought, Control V, poof, it appears there. Go through the entire free write and find any other ideas that are on that same broad topic. Control X, Control V. Okay? When you're done with that, look at the next idea. Call that group 2, just because it's next. That's all for right now. But go through the entire free write and find any other ideas that are on that same basic topic. Control X, Control V. So you put all the group 2 together. Do the same with group 3, group 4, however many groups you've got. And you can define group any way you want, but as long as it's the same basic topic, that's a group. So let's just say you have 5 different groups. This is for argument. So you group the ideas. Now you've got these 5 different groups. There's no logical order to them other than you named them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? Now you want to actually put them in order. So look at the 5 different groups. One of those groups logically comes first. Okay? It may not be the first group in the book, but of this little free write that you've done, it comes first. So copy the whole group. Control X, move it to the top. Control V, paste it down. You got a new group 1 now. This is after the first group. Find the next 4, find the next one. That would be logically, the second. Same thing, Control X, Control V, move that. The same with the other groups. So now what you've got is all the groups are in a logical order. Okay? Oh, there you go. Okay, so now, look at that first group. Okay, the new group 1. Okay, all the different pieces of information that you've written, begin to put them in order within group 1. Put them in order. And do the same with group 2, group 3, and so on. So what you've got now is a whole flow of ideas. Okay, now it's not going to be nearly complete. When you get to the end of group 1 and you begin group 2, it's not going to necessarily flow together. There may be a lot of information that's going to be needed to add, you're going to need to add to connect the two. You need to work on the transitions, in other words. But at least you know that it comes second and third and so on. So put them in order and then begin to read it. Oops. Okay, begin to read it. Okay, but keep your fingers on the keyboard while you're reading. Here's why. Because as you're looking at it, your eyes are going to see what's on the screen. But your mind is going to be seeing what's missing. Okay, now I don't know why, that's what the brain does. I'm not an expert on the brain, but that's what's going on. Your eyes are seeing what's on the screen, your mind is seeing what's missing. And that's the information that you need to add, to expand. Well, your mind is connected to your fingers. Okay? So your eyes see, your mind sees what's missing, your fingers start typing what your mind is seeing. And poof, while you're reading, it's magically expanding. Now, if you don't know how to type, it's it's not quite so poetic. But if you're a decent typist, this is what goes on. You read it, your mind tells you what's missing, your fingers type it up, and it begins to expand. It's beautiful. You begin to expand from the inside out. Begin to make sense out of it. Now, sometimes questions are going to come up. Like, how do I move this forward? Oh, there you go. Okay. Sometimes questions are going to come up. When they come up, you don't want to stop everything and start doing research. Why? Because when you start doing research, you're going to lose the flow. And you want to keep that flow going. So if a question comes up, just write the question right there, wherever it shows up in the manuscript. Type the question and use square brackets. Okay? Why do you use square brackets? Because in normal writing, we don't use square brackets. Nobody does. You know, I mean, they have a few esoteric uses, but for the most part, we don't use square brackets. So if you have a square bracket in your manuscript, what you can do is do a word search for left square bracket. Just type the left square bracket into the search bar and search it, and it's going to bring you to every one of your queries. So it's really easy. I mean, and remember, for a short free write, this isn't that big of a deal. But if you've written a whole book, you know, you're still going to have questions as you're writing. It's a lot easier when you open up that huge manuscript to just do a search for left square bracket. Poof, it takes you from one square bracket to the next. And that's how you add to it. That's how you add to it. That's pretty much it. I mean, and you just keep doing it. You know, here's an exercise for you. You can shoot this with your phone if you want, because I don't expect you to be able to write all this down. But it's a little free writing exercise. Okay, just to help you going. I just threw in a bunch of questions, but list stories that come to mind. You know, and just go wild. Don't worry about a perfect first sentence though. It's wonderful when you get a perfect first sentence, but it's not the first sentence that you write. Okay? It's seldom that the first piece that you read is actually the beginning of the book. You know, the first chapter may be written way after you've already begun the book. Okay? So that's that. And any questions?
So Mary McKeever,
Yes. Mary. Oops.
Mary's online, and she had a couple of comments I wanted to share. This is going back to Bernard. She said, it sounds like it took your friend Bernard a lot of time to get to the point that he could recall what was most troubling to him.
Sure.
Just a reminder for us as Stephen ministers that it takes a lot of time. And of course, we're meant for the long-term view as Stephen ministers. We're with people for a long time, many of us for years. She also, hold on. She said, I would like to write my memoirs, the things I feel are most important that I want to leave for my children. I've written a healing narrative or two, but I'd like to do much more and tie the narratives together in some cohesive way. And then her final comments are, it sounds like encouraging our care receivers to journal would be helpful. Also encouraging our care receivers to link events to feelings. Helpful in creative order and organization to bring that out of the confusion of the events, the traumas that so many people are carrying traumas. I wonder if you might comment just for a moment about the idea of trauma, because that's like the buzzword right now, because it's the thing that so many people are feeling, trauma and anxiety, and how that might be. Do you have experience of that, being helped by this writing process?
Well, that's some of the stories that I told were about trauma. What I encourage you to do is just write. Writing a journal is fairly straightforward. But what happens is that we tend to leave a lot of details out of it. That's why it's helpful for you as caregivers. Can be real helpful, because if your care receivers do their journal, you can read it and you can begin asking questions. What do you mean by this? Who was this? What happened next? And a lot of the stuff they just didn't think to write because they know it so well that they don't even think that, they're reading it as they're reading it as the writer, not as another reader. So they know all the stuff that's not on the paper yet. But you who don't know their story, the questions that come up, you can ask them. And just you have to keep asking questions. You have to keep asking more questions. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Can I add something, Ken?
Yes.
I just want I just want to add to that anybody who is going through trauma, make sure you have that support system in place as well, professional help as needed, and so that they can it will enable them to further write their stories. But it's important to have that safety and that safety mechanism in place. So I just wanted
This is
to
Emily, my wife. She's a former therapist.
I'm a licensed professional counselor.
So she's not just winging it. She's got some.
Yes. This comes from 15 years of clinical experience and personal experience, too.
And me seldom disagreeing with her.
That's right.
Thank you.
Any other questions or any other thoughts, comments? Yeah.
And just one. A wise person once said in this general topic of writing a book, everyone has one good book in them.
Well, I've written a number of books.
Well,
Are you saying all the other ones? No. I was trying. I believe that.
Not a limit of one.
I was
But
kidding.
a
No,
minimum.
I'm a strong advocate of that. I believe that very strongly. Everybody's got a book in them. And now with the technology, it's easy to do. I'm a book coach with the National Speakers Association. And NSA members all know that they have to have books. They know it. Whatever their area of specialization is, at some point they have to come up with a book on that topic. Not just for back of the room sales, but also for their credibility. It used to be that, if you have a book, wow, this is amazing, you got a book. Nowadays, because of the technology, if you don't have a book, it's wow, you got to get it.
Just one other dimension of writing. For me, journaling is a response to the invitation in the Psalms to pour out our hearts to God. And I have a huge box full of journals. When things are troubling me and I can't sleep at night, I can get up and write out to God what's in my heart, what I'm struggling with, and often find a place of peace in letting it go.
It's the epitome of writing for healing.
Writing for healing, yes. And also reflection and, of course, joys. So the journaling is an expression of love and prayer to God, is another kind of writing. Maybe not for publishing for everyone, but certainly for...
You don't have to publish. My students who had these major breakthroughs while they were writing their iSearch papers, they didn't publish them. My student who had the alcoholic father, she never published it. But that's not the goal, And for Bernard, my book, Never Be Afraid, he wasn't thinking of publishing. He just wanted to tell the story. I was the one who wanted to publish it, but you're right, you don't have to publish it at all. It's nice to know that you can, if you want, but you don't have to. And healing doesn't come about simply because you shared it with somebody else. That's another element of it. I wrote my journal during the breast cancer. That was healing on its own. Sharing it was a whole new level of healing. Of the 21 ways, those are the first two.
We've just had a Christian formation adult class series that Beth Gerwig and our Christian formation group was a part of on for the month of poetry. And there were several wonderful events as a part of that for Sunday morning at 11. One of the things we did was to have a panel on writing as a spiritual practice, but it's really writing as a way to grow closer to God. And when we talked about maybe writing letters to the person who's died as a way of mourning, you could also talk about writing your thoughts or prayers to God. Sometimes so many of our people are hesitant to talk about God out loud, especially pray out loud. Oh my gosh, that's like the scariest thing ever. But if they could write those prayers to God, if you could encourage them as Stephen ministers, nobody sees that but them. and God knows what's on their hearts, but that may encourage them to find the language. And even having the language to talk to God can be a healing part of the issue if the thing that they're struggling with is the faith issue, that they don't feel close to God, or they don't know how to talk to God, or they feel that God is silent. So, I mean, we're kind of adapting this in ways for our purposes here that I think really can open up the possibilities for people. The other thing I would just say is, many of you know, I've said this a ton of times, I meet with families all the time at the point of the death of a loved one, and we'll go to talk about the memorial service, and they'll say, oh, well, you know, Dad had a very private faith, so, I mean, I know he believed, but I don't really know what he believed. I mean, I'm sure he believed in heaven, but we never talked about that, or I'm not really sure. It was a private faith, and if nothing else, if we can't get comfortable talking to our families about what it is we believe and what our journeys have been, if we can write it down and have it there, maybe they'll come across that someday, and it'll be healing for them. If not healing for us, a healing opportunity for them when they most need that. And you alluded to some of that earlier as
That's
well.
the legacy.
Yeah,
You're writing
exactly.
it so they can read it.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Any other questions before we conclude today? It's been so good to have you, Ken. We appreciate it.
Oh, thanks.
We'll have your books in the Stephen Ministry Library as well, so we'll be able to see those.
Thank you. Thank you for all your comments.